James Sedgwick from Newman University. James, I can't see you on the screen. I think it's this problem that I've got two screens operating. Oh, hi, got you. Okay, hi James. So James, the title of James's talk is Therapy and Diversity, an untherapeutic relationship, in brackets, so to speak. James, over to you.
Can people hear me?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So thank you for conference for inviting me to speak. As you've heard, the title of my article is posed as a question. Is the burgeoning relationship between therapy and diversity therapeutic or untherapeutic? At the risk of terminating the suspense, let me present my conclusions first so you know what's coming. I believe the engagement between therapy and diversity principles is far from ideal. My argument is that it needs to be paused, reviewed, and redirected urgently. At present, several unhelpful ideas have real momentum, and there is a clear opportunity to at least partially replace them with better ones. Whilst this article is being published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, its hoped for audience is the large number of clinicians who are writing and reading about diversity matters in less academic and more professional forums, such as Therapy Today, which is the in-house magazine of the BACP, as well as participating in the proliferating number of 3-hour workshops on the topic. The article came out of my experience of reading many of such articles. It cites a significant number of contributions and could easily have mentioned a good deal more. And with the greatest of respect to my co-contributors here today, who are offering weightier and lengthier contributions on the subtopic of diversity, it is exactly in these more general professional spaces that majority opinion is being shaped. And for this reason, my introduction here hugs close to what is happening on the ground, because it is here that I want to have an impact. Whilst I appreciate the good intentions that are driving grassroots discussions of diversity, I think there are grounds for qualified concern. I'm concerned that when asked to recommend reading on diversity-related topics to my students, I struggle to identify more than a handful of items from the current deluge that I can endorse in complete confidence. I am uneasy as I often witness trainees being warmly endorsed for diversity sensitivity, for doing little more than making stereotypical observations about purported group differences, whilst inserting the words power and privilege into the sentence at strategic points. I am troubled by the persistent minority of therapy clients who report having felt boxed into simplistically sketched group characteristics by their therapists, and then patronized by the assumption that they are perturbed at having to navigate minor discrepancies in interpersonal power. And if my private conversations with colleagues across the field are in any way representative, I know I'm not the only person to be feeling this way. Since I don't believe the individuals leading the conversation on diversity are either incapable or incurious, the article attempts the necessary work of analysing how I believe things have taken a wrong turn. Across the course of 3 sections, I identify key difficulties both at the level of ideas and, perhaps more unusually, at the level of institutional and professional self-organisation. The problems with the diversity conversation can only be fully understood by considering the intersection between these 2 factors. Inevitably, I can only offer an abridged version of the points made more fully in the article itself. So the first section begins with a critical consideration of how the term diversity is used in this literature and how certain categories of personhood have come to garner the most attention. I draw attention to what I argue is an irreconcilable tension between a celebratory approach to diversity, which suggests that all forms of life are worthy of respect in different ways, and a critical approach, which asserts that some social groups need to be understood in terms of ubiquitous and consequential oppression. However, since oppression impedes the optimal formation of culture, the attempt to combine the celebratory and the critical can make it seem as though we're being asked to validate a group who have yet to throw off their chains. I am often left with the sense that many authors simply flip between these viewpoints across the course of an article, with the overall effect sometimes being one of problematic muddle about what is actually being claimed. The primary emphasis upon the trio of race, sex, gender, and sexuality is also far less than a self-evident priority. These may well be categories around which people are encouraged to actively organise their identities, but they are far from the only ones. Moreover, if we are attempting to account for social disadvantage, then based on the available data, individuals who are poor or of below average intelligence or attractiveness would have as great a claim on our attention and empathy. As I say, only somewhat mischievously in the article, workshops on how to work with ugly people are thus far notable by their absence. The diversity conversation our presents priorities and the conceptual apparatus we use to support them often seem to have been uncritically imported from outside of our discipline, or have politically muscled their way in. To take a solitary example, consider the LGBTQ+ acronym. This shorthand has been adopted without any sense of the various wider social forces and interests that precipitated its coining. It really isn't clear that an artificially amalgamated category formed for other social and political purposes can act as a basis for the psychological understanding of the individuals these categories purport to represent. Therapy is a practice where accuracy and details matter a great deal. The L and the G alone often require quite distinct consideration, and that's before we even get to the other letters. While judicious referencing of ideas from outside our discipline is inevitable, I submit it is not beyond us as a profession to develop, use, and circulate concepts which emerge from our clinical practice and would better support our work. The second section of the article shows how diversity material itself is often, ironically, not very diverse, proceeding as it often does through a series of interchangeable arguments to fairly standardized conclusions. It seems more than a little paradoxical that a concern with capturing the diversity of human experience ends up describing everything in the same narrow way. More specifically, I argue that there is a near exclusive focus upon relatively minor injuries of misrecognition, othering, shaming, and exclusion, with scant acknowledgement of other, sometimes more important social disadvantages. The article places particular emphasis upon domination and exploitation, instances where the key issue is deprivation of control, rather than the withholding of dignity, as a kind of social injury which is overlooked in current conceptualization. Equally, the non-politicization and depoliticization of devalued traits, such as ugliness, is a different kind of injury again, denying people the capacity to name and recognize them as the source of unjust distress. An exclusive focus upon slight injuries of recognition, typified by the peculiar deference extended towards the concept of microaggressions, can plausibly be traced to the fact that most therapeutic modalities only know how to name, conceptualize, and address injuries of recognition. Social disadvantage finds itself misrepresented to fit in with our working practices, rather than our working practices being adjusted to better account for social disadvantage. A related maneuver occurs when diversity articles insist that structural and systemic factors be acknowledged, only to return at the nearest opportunity to the comfortable and familiar terrain of minor interpersonal difficulties. Finally, the insistence that therapists can become more effective at working with diverse client groups by gaining reflective insight into their supposed prejudices tends to crowd out the more important pursuit of critical and informed outsight. Rather than encouraging therapists to turn inwards and purge themselves of imagined prejudices, would it not be better to look outwards and learn more about complex social realities? What links these seemingly disparate problems together is the sense that the clarion call for the profession to wake up and mend its ways tends to end up proposing an unreformed business as usual. And we have good reason to ask at this point, well, why is this? So the third section of the article suggests that diversity material inevitably becomes redirected down familiar and unsuitable pathways because of a vested professional interest in keeping our theoretical allegiances unblemished and institutional arrangements unchanged. If you believe that your client's problems are caused by ongoing deficits in power and privilege, then ideally you should work to help them eliminate them. But this would entail something closer to consciousness raising, emancipatory education, or direct political action than therapy as we usually conceive it. If you really believe that each client deserves to be seen by a practitioner who has an immersive familiarity with their particular form of life, then you have to create the economic and institutional preconditions for targeted recruitment to happen. I submit that if you begin with a professional self-image which presumes a lone practitioner seeing a full spectrum of clients on the basis of a standard therapy training based around theoretical mastery, clinical skill, and reflective capacity, then you will inevitably end up with the same errors that I have identified here. They follow on as a consequence. I don't believe that a reconfigured approach to therapeutic work can solve all the problems, because I don't believe that therapy is always the best or only response to certain difficulties. Yet there are certain things we could do better. Taking diversity seriously, therefore, entails far-reaching and sometimes difficult questions about our professional organisation, self-understanding, and knowledge production. And it may well be here that the work needs to begin. Okay, so I've come in at 10 minutes. Do I get a prize?
You caught me out then. I was writing things down, and James, thank you very much for that. I guess that's raised some really difficult kind of questions, hasn't it? About training, about practice, about where we locate our praxis, really. Very difficult questions, I think. So are there any questions, people, or comments or thoughts?
I suppose I had something to say there. It raises some really interesting notions about the problems of being led by theory, being theory-led and not led by clients. And I just sort of wondered, perhaps in what way you practice yourself as a therapist in that regard.
You've raised an interesting question. I'll do my best to respond to it. I suspect that in this area, theory sometimes takes the form of wider knowledge, and I think part of the reason for that is therapy training tends to kind of channel our sense of things into sitting in a room with a client with very, very limited preconceptions. And I think therapists are therefore in some ways quite uncomfortable as a matter of their professional training with the notion of bringing in a more generalized knowledge about how things are into the room as a way of understanding the person sat in front of them. Certainly part of the reason that I came at the subject from the angle that I did is because, you know, in my own work and the client group that I worked with for 10 years, I found it invaluable to think in terms of typicalities, but there wasn't really a shortcut to learning that. It was simply a case of sitting with lots and lots and lots of clients again and again and again, and noticing the kind of the things that seemed to come up in the same sort of way with minor variations. So rather than just theory or practice, I want to think about it in terms of theory, practice, and different kinds of knowledge that are not typically produced and circulated, or perhaps can't be circulated that easily within a profession as we currently conceive it.
So it kind of echoes the idea that perhaps therapy begins again and again with every client that we work with, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think the other point I would make on this is, and I do think this is a really important difference. I mean, as soon as I finished my therapy training, I worked for the National Health Service for 10 years. I live in the second biggest city in the country, and I worked as part of a team of 100 therapists. And it was quite commonplace for us to think, you know, this client might work really well with this kind of person because they understand their corner of the world better. And I think that's an option that you have available to you if you conceive of therapy as a kind of a team activity. And that was really what my final point was about, that if you think of therapy as we have to equip everybody to work with everybody, you actually start from a quite different place about what your therapist should know before they step into the room and what kind of life experience they have that might contribute towards their efficacy as a practitioner.
Thanks. Good talk as well. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Any other questions? We've got a few minutes.
May I ask? James, thanks very much for your talk. From a visceral point of view for me, I get the message of read between the lines.
Okay.
but also there's something about what is it we're covering up.
Okay, is there a question?
Yeah, and it's literally what is it we're covering up, because some of what you're talking about is we're trying to assimilate a lot of theories and stuff far too quickly for us to be able to even digest it, I believe.
I
And
suppose
it's almost like this rush is some kind of cover-up.
I mean, I think cover-up is a slightly ungenerous term. It might apply to some things. And I think
Yeah, I'm being deliberately provocative here. So
yeah, sure. I think part of it is I just think there are certain things that I see that are not typically raised or thought about in this way within the profession, including some of the things I thought about. I think the notion that in order to be a fully rounded practitioner, one must have, in addition to high levels of self-awareness, theoretical mastery, and clinical acumen, a kind of a knowledge of forms of life is just not something that I think typically occurs to most people. But then you arrive at this kind of conversation, and then it means that you end up trying to solve the problem with a relatively limited palette of particular tools. I'm not sure that's necessarily a question of covering anything up. I think it may be a question that it's simply thinking a little more outside the box, or taking a particular step that some people haven't taken yet, or perhaps may choose not to take for reasons that I haven't foreseen. But I think if you really wanted to name what I think is sometimes being covered up, which I think Del already hinted at a little bit, there's a slightly high-minded tone to the way some of these articles are being written and presented. Not always, but sometimes. And I think sometimes misgivings are not said because people are afraid of being accused of being a bigot. And I think that's regrettable. It's certainly something that I think is in the air sometimes when I speak. It certainly isn't a position I recognize in myself. But I think we have to create a forum where misgivings about some of what's happening can be raised, because I think we can do things better. I do think this is an important conversation. I'm not here today to be destructive. I'm here today to be constructive. But sometimes you have to speak honestly about what you think is going wrong, and which is what I've done here today.
thank you. Thank you.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes, I think this will probably be the last question on this bit, just so that people know.
Okay, thank you. James, that was really interesting, and I hope I've written some of your comments down correctly, and please tell me if I'm wrong about being immersive in the client's life, in which case we need to target recruitment training. And my question is about the beginnings of colleagues training, because I teach newcomers to the counselling process, and it's actually quite interesting how funding currently in this country means there are two economic groups that can come for this absolute initial training. Mm-hmm. There's a group who receive grants, and so the funding is paid for, and there's another group who can afford to pay for it themselves. And we're missing out on a whole group of lived experiences in the middle. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, so I suppose the subtext of my comments, which again takes us even further away from usual topics of conversation, if you see therapy as a subsidized activity, which is a whole other conversation within the profession itself, as I'm sure you appreciate, if therapy becomes a centrally subsidized activity, you have the capacity within that to direct your services in certain ways, to make certain services available for certain sections of the community, and to set certain requirements on your recruitment. If you conceive of it as a profession which is self-funded and self-directed, people taking decisions to approach training courses themselves and going through a self-selecting body of professionals, then it's much harder to do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everybody. I think this is making my head spin, because there just aren't answers to these things, are there? The tension just continues, I guess. It's my sense of it. But anyway, it's time for a break. I think we've got just about time to boil the kettle, if that's the nature of your stimulant. And we resume at 11:10.